Good morning and welcome to the Finance and Administration Committee meeting of Marin Water for October 23rd. May I have a roll call, please?
Vice Chair Diana Mayer. Oh, you're on mute.
Here.
And Chair Jed Smith.
Here. Terrific. We have a relatively straightforward agenda this morning, but we'll first move to any public comments on non-agenda matters.
There are none.
Great. So moving on to our regular items, the minutes of the Finance Administration Committee meeting approval, and then the monthly financial update and a reserve policy update. Any public comments on the minutes?
There are none.
And may I please have a motion to, or do you have any corrections to the minutes, Diana?
No corrections and move to, move to adopt the minutes.
Terrific. So then with that said, they're submitted and we can move on to item 3B in hasty fashion. We are on to our finance update.
All right, good morning, Chair Smith and Vice Chair Mayer. My name is Brett Uppendahl. I'm the district's finance director. This is the routine item, as you mentioned, financial update. We do it each month. We are now 25% through the fiscal year, so 3 months in out of the 12. If you look here at the first slide, as we typically do revenues, water revenue there tracking better than the fiscal year, 28%. I'll talk about that in a couple of slides, more of the details on why that's actually a little bit low for our expectations at this time. But generally speaking, our revenues are coming in, within a range, as I've been mentioning the last few months, that we're, hoping to see, and within a range that still matches our expenditure level. Capital revenue is a little bit behind that 25% at the moment, and that's just kind of more due to an early timing here on the CMF, and kind of some of we have, as you'll see in a minute here, we have done 3 months of billing, and so the second month in that is the larger cycle, and so things will even off next month as we get there on revenues. Expenditures here, kind of just glancing down that budget to actual column in the middle, pretty well on track, right around that 25% kind of linear mark through the fiscal year. As we've seen the last couple of year, personnel services is a little bit below the trend. And so we'll keep an eye a little closer to that as we get through the holidays, and as we get into January, start making projections on what that might look like towards the end of the year. Other items are much more kind of in line with the linear trends. So not much to report on there, again, early in the year. Capital expenses down there, as you can see, we've got a pretty large capital budget now, when we take into account the carry forward from the prior year, as well as the current capital projects. So Alex and his team are busy. They've done a good job encumbering contracts and getting moving. So you can see they're 32% of the way to the budget, which is good for this fiscal year. It's particularly good considering that we do have quite a large carry forward from last year, and all those projects are still moving well. So kudos to his team.
Hey, Brett, quick question on, is the, we're 2.9 million ahead of expenses last year. Is that on target for our budget year to date?
Yeah, if you recall last year, we were end of the year quite a bit below budget. And so this is actually closer to where we'd expect to be than we were last year.
On the expenses side.
On the expenses side. So, and you can see a lot of that's their maintenance operations in the top side, in the top or second column, I should say. So we're ahead of where we were last year. Some of that may be timing in terms of some of our water purchases. That's some of our larger dollar amounts. There are some lumpiness, kind of larger payments that go through earlier in the year here. And I can check to make sure we're kind of comparing apples to apples in terms of our bigger expenses. But we are kind of more online with where we'd expect to be that 25% this year compared to last year where we're lagging behind the entire year.
Okay, thanks.
This is the breakdown of water revenues, by far our largest revenue source. The fixed charges there, the CMF and the service charge there, the second and fourth columns, those are pretty well close to expected actuals. If you look at the very bottom row, percent of expected actuals, that's what I tend to focus on. So 99% and 98% in those two categories. So those are where we want to be. Water sales is not as healthy of a picture there. You can look down and see percent of expected actuals on the first column. The very last number there, 92%. That's essentially telling us we're 8% behind where we'd expect to be. And you can really see the last 2 months here, August and September, if you kind of glance back up on the water sales side, We're kind of about 10% each of those months behind where we would have expected to be if we were in a perfect budget world. Obviously, the budget world is not perfect and reality exists, but that is starting to become a little bit of a trend the last 2 months. I think we talked about it quite a bit over the summer, kind of unusually cool summer. And I think we've already seen early rains now. So this may be a trend we have to look into a little bit more closely as we get into the winter and certainly the spring months. With expenses also lagging a little below, we're still in balance in terms of overall cash in versus cash out. But it is a little bit of a trend that we're starting to see in terms of, lower than expected water sales dollars. You can see a similar trend over there in the watershed fee, which is another way of looking at our kind of variable revenues based on kind of consumption. And you can really see it here in the next slide where we talk about water consumption, just flat out how much, in this case, acre feet we are producing for our customers. We've definitely taken a dip down there. So you can see the 6217 acre feet through September is pretty well behind last year's nearly 6,600 acre feet. It's about 6 or 7% behind the trajectory for last year. And we're a little closer to 8% behind our historical average here. So the 10-year average there at the top, 6,657. That was the number we almost made last year. And then as I mentioned a few times here now, we're lagging a little below that here early in the year. Again, 25% of the year, not something we can draw a lot of conclusions from, but these are some of our larger months here in the summer. So we'll have to look closer at this as we get into this in the winter months. And again, as we get into the spring to monitor our consumption levels. We've been including this slide the last few months. This kind of gets into some of the different places and the tiers, the percent of the total by tier that the district is seeing in terms of consumption. Relatively similar to last year. You can see tier 3 down a little bit, and we're getting kind of more of the overall sales in tier 1. And so, again, it's a lower base overall because we're producing less water for our customer base. And you can probably start to draw some conclusions here. Again, I'd want to see certainly the next month. So we have a full kind of two billing cycles for each part of our district in there. And we are working behind the scenes, as we mentioned a few times in the last couple of FACs. We do have some analytical work being done on last year's total consumption. So we're not diving quite into this year's we're looking at here, but we are looking into last year's to bring to the board or the FAC in the coming months, kind of more of a breakdown on consumption by tier and consumption patterns over the last couple of years.
Maybe even, and I don't know if we can do this, but like top 100 customers or top 1,000 customers might be better than looking at it by tier. Maybe
a lot of different ways to look at it with 60,000 customers, and
right.
About 90% of them are residential, but we are looking into those right now and breaking them down. So we'll start bringing those back.
Yep.
So that's really it for the finance monthly financial review section today. Just to summarize here in the bullet points we have, so our rate revenues are 6% below the budget. And that's largely driven, if not fully driven, by our water consumption, which is about 5.5 or 6% lower than last year and 7% lower than our 10-year average. So consumption down obviously translates to revenues being down at this point in the year. Again, 25% of the year, and we're only through 3 billing cycles. So more information to come. The good news on here is that our operating and capital expenditures are also below budget, so they're balancing out the cash flow. But we do want to make sure we are continuing to support ongoing operations, and we don't want to have to pull back on capital expenses. So we'll continue monitoring and report out in coming months.
Great. Any comments, Director Meyer? Diana?
No, I don't think so. The only thing that I've been asked about by a couple of people lately, and this might be more appropriate for a water efficiency, but I just put out there that a couple of people have commented to me lately about whether there'd be a possibility of doing the billing monthly as opposed to bi-monthly, so people have more insight into what they're doing with their water. Might exacerbate some of the financial issues, although I doubt it. It might help with water efficiency. I don't know I just wondered if that had ever been looked at.
Yeah, that's a good question. It is something the district has looked at a few times in the last, I'd say, decade or so. I think that the general consensus is that the costs for monthly billing have generally been prohibitive. When we looked at them in the past, we would have to nearly double our meter reading staff in order to kind of complete the billing cycle each month. And then we'd also have to produce and print that many more bills and process that many more payments. So when it's been looked at, I'm trying to recall, I think the numbers have been, closer to $1 million or maybe $2 million a year more we'd have to spend.
Wow.
I don't think the revenue would be there to offset it necessarily. That being said, I think the points you're making are good points in the sense that, from a customer perspective, you're getting more immediate feedback on the monthly billing cycles.
Mhm.
That's definitely something we plan to do as part of the AMI project.
I was gonna say maybe when we're all electronic.
Yeah, so I think,
Mhm.
long term, I'd say over the next, 3 to 5 years, we're hoping to transition most of the district onto monthly billing via the AMI project, and that would cut down on the need for meter readers to be out there every day, but it still will have some expense on the actual bill printing and bill presentment and bill processing. But those are all numbers that will be coming back to you over the next couple years as we look into the AMI implementation.
Thank you.
Great. It's interesting to note that there's good and bad news about having lower water sales, right? We're conserving more. We're planning for the future better in some ways, and that's possibly a result of a lot of our efforts in addition to just weather. But if you notice the sensitivity, if we're only down 5.7% from water consumption, but about 9% on revenues,
Hmm.
looked to me like that's coming from the tier 3 sales were down 1%. So we're highly sensitive to the financial impact of those tier 3 and tier 4 customers who pay more. So as we're successful in this effort, it'll likely have an impact on the financials
Yes.
more, and therefore probably would force us to be tighter on the expense side.
Yeah, and there's a lot of ways to look at that, but I think you described it pretty well. I think it is very sensitive, especially at that tier 2, tier 3 breakpoint. Off the top of my head, I believe that's at 25 CCFs, which is a relatively common number for kind of a 4 to 5 person household. And so I think there's a lot that are right in that area. That's typically the cutoff where you start seeing outdoor irrigation. And so I think when we do a good job in conservation, we do see it on the fiscal side, but it's all kind of a balance over the long term. It's a balancing kind of exercise, and that's why we'd look at the rates every 4 years. The goal is to be able to raise enough money through the rates to support operations and support expenses, and so that's why you look at it every 4 years to balance off where we are in consumption with what revenues we need to bring in, and so that's kind of the analytical piece we'll look at in the next year. But you're right, now that we're 2 to 3 years out in the cycle, there's less control, and so we have to just essentially kind of adapt to the consumption levels and the revenues that are coming in. Fortunately, as we'll get into the next item, reserves help kind of bridge that gap a little bit, so we can maintain operations and maintain our capital expenses, even if there is a slight fluctuation or a couple percentage lower than we expected in revenue. So that's the good thing.
Where are you? It's not an agenda item, so I don't know if this is off-piste, but where are you in the budgeting process and thoughts about rates going forward for next year?
Well, we're still kind of closing the books on last year, so we're still getting our final audit. We're about 2 or 3 weeks away from that, and so that really is kind of the beginning of the budget process. You look at how we ended last year, you kind of start to look at 2 to 3 year trends, and then we start making the kind of underlying financial plan assumptions. And so that's kind of the base layers, the financial plan. What does the district need? What's our revenue requirement? And then we'll look at that. And like, as I mentioned in the last comment, we'll look at that with a consultant to find out how to best allocate the rate structure to bring those revenues in. And so, to answer your question, we're very early in that process. We're not quite there yet. We are starting to just build that first building block of kind of 2 to 3 year trends, plus the longer term financial plan.
So you think maybe January, February we'll start to have some?
Yes, I think January and February we have a good idea of kind of the basics of the financial plan, and then that's when we'll probably start looking into the consultants to help us with our rate structure.
Terrific. Okay, great. Any public comment?
There are none.
All right, thank you. Moving on to our reserve policy update, please.
Right. So this is a reserve policy update. And I've mentioned in the last, I'd say 2 to 3 finance committees, as well as right when we did the budget last year, I mentioned that we're taking a look at our reserves. Reserves are generally kind of refilling or kind of going back up to historical levels here, as we'll talk about. And so the board does have some options, as we've been doing the last couple of years, in terms of tweaking the reserve policy and analyzing where we may want to start adding additional reserves for future planned items. So just to kind of take a step back here, our current reserve policy, board policy number 46, outlines why we have reserves and the purpose for them. And so here's the summary here that you can see on the screen. Per the policy, our reserve funds are accumulated each year and managed to allow the district to maintain our daily operations and our planned capital investments during times of uncertainty. And it also, reserves can be used to stabilize long-term water rates so that we're not having to kind of have customers feel the brunt of the whims of any given year, whether it's economic uncertainty and or whether it's climate uncertainty. The district currently has 7 different reserve funds, and I'll go over those here in a couple of slides. Each of those funds has a very specific purpose, and we have made the practice of assigning a minimum target and then a kind of essentially a maximum target amount. Each year by policy, we review the balances of the reserves, and we definitely take a closer look at the time of approving the budget and as well as when we approve rates. The last major update we did to the policy was in 2023. And the board may recall that in 2023, we added the water supply project reserve, and we also tweaked the language on the existing reserve funds to be more consistent across the board and to add those targets that I mentioned earlier. I'm happy to report to the board that all of our reserve funds that we currently have reached their minimum target balances, and I'll show you those here in a second. And so that gives us some opportunity going forward, as I mentioned in my opening comments. So this is a 5-year kind of historical look at where the board reserves have been. And so you can kind of see the drought, perfectly here right in the middle. Fiscal 21, we had well-funded reserves going into the drought. We had to rely on those reserves for the next 2 years to weather the storm and to keep operations going while we adjusted our rates and while we adjusted our budget. Reserves essentially went from 72 million down to 44 million. In the last 2 years, due to expenditure savings and a couple of revenue increases, mostly due to interest rates, we've been able to increase our reserves back up to that historical level in the mid-70s range. And so this is a kind of a simplified look at the reserves. I mentioned we have 7 different reserves funds. This kind of groups them into logical order in terms of the way I like to look at them. You can see there the other amount, the yellow, that has grown this last year, and I believe I mentioned it last FAC. A large part of that is dedicated towards our Sonoma County water payment, and that was approved by the Sonoma County Board a couple weeks ago, and so those funds will be going out the door soon. Again, this is a look as of June 30th, so things have happened since June 30th, but this is the way our financials would look as of June 30th of the last fiscal year. Here is a listing of our current reserve balances and our reserve funds. And so each of these funds are listed on the left, the purpose there in the middle, the minimum balance, what that translates to in dollars, the target balance, and then what that translates to in dollars. And then in the final column, our current balance. I note there with that asterisk that our current balance is still preliminary. We haven't finished the audit yet, so there may be some slight changes between these categories, but I don't expect anything major. So just to kind of run down these, we have an insurance reserve that's meant to be, about cover the cost of our self-insurance reserve. So at a minimum, we want to be able to pay our self-insurance reserve one time if we have a large event. Our target amount would be a 2-time self-insurance reserve, and that'd be a pretty conservative estimate there, but we do have that as far as our target. Workers' comp, again, those things happen. They're out of our control largely. We have an actuary review our outstanding cases and our case history, and they actually help set the target for us there. And so the actuary has kind of given us a range of 3.8 to 5.8 and where to set that. We've historically held around the target amount there, 5.8, so we have not made an adjustment. So we're at the full target balance there with our workers' comp reserve. Capital reserve. That is meant for, if there's contingencies, meaning projects are more expensive than we originally estimated, or for grant matching, or for unanticipated projects that may come throughout the year. We've tied that target to an annual amount of our capital maintenance fee. So our target amount, our minimum balance there is 25% of our capital maintenance fee, and our target amount is 50% of our annual capital maintenance fee revenue. I would mention too that also accumulates unspent capital funds. So if we don't spend all of our CIP budget each year, it drops back into the capital reserve. We also do accumulate funds from connection fees or capacity charges as we have them now. That goes into the capital fund as well. So that gets a variety of sources coming in. Currently, we have an $8 million balance in the capital fund, so it's near the target amount. For operating, it's generally there for unanticipated expenses and to kind of, as I mentioned before, weather the storm of economic uncertainty. The target amount there, or the minimum amount there, is 2 months of our operating expense, and the target amount is 3 months. That one also is at the target amount, so we have done a good job of refilling that reserve. Rate stabilization is meant to really handle water sales revenue fluctuations. We're also required by some of our existing debt covenants to maintain a minimum balance there. And so we have that at the minimum 10.8 million right now, as we've been seeing relatively consistent water sales. The previous conversation notwithstanding, we've been in a pretty good range there in water sales. So we feel keeping that at the minimum is appropriate for now. Water supply project reserve, the second from the bottom. That is a little bit different of a structure where we have that budgeted each year to add $2.5 million for that reserve as part of the budget process. That is intended to accumulate funds over the long term to either provide seed funding for pilot projects and/or to help fund some of the larger projects that we have planned going forward. So that one by policy is $2.5 million a year. So we're at the target amount of $5 million after 2 years. And then finally, pension stabilization. This one gets to be a little bit kind of wonky in a certain sense, but CalPERS is largely driven by changes in the stock market, and so those are very much outside of our control. They have a smoothing method within CalPERS, and when they start to allocate costs back to us, if there's been less returns than they plan on. And so we're kind of trying to tie our reserve there to what would help kind of balance off their smoothing on the way back to us. So we want about 35% of our unfunded accrued liability. And that's 3.6 million for our minimum amount, up to about 60% of our UAL, which is kind of where you might see after 2 years of their smoothing, they might impact us there. So we're holding right in the middle there, 4.7 currently in our reserve for pension stabilization. And the idea there would be not to have to cut the budget if CalPERS says you have to pay an extra $1 million or $2 million in the short term, because it does balance off, over multiple years. There's ups and there's downs in the stock market, so you don't want to have to make budgetary changes just because of 1 or 2 funky years in the kind of macro economy. So overall, bottom line there, our minimum amounts are $44 million. Our target amount is $81 million in all these reserves, and we're comfortably towards the top of that. We're at the $67 million in terms of our overall balance for board reserves. For those that don't like to look at numbers, this is a way of looking at it graphically. The yellows here are the minimums. The grays are our target amount, and then the blue in the middle is where we currently are. So if that helps the public or the board kind of understand where we're at, we're close to full in our major kind of operating and capital reserves. We're right in a nice place in the middle there for some of those other stabilization reserves. And then workers' comp and water supply, we're at our target as well. And as I mentioned earlier, other over there, that's just our additional funds that we have. Largely that is for Sonoma County water payments. That'll go away as we see the next year's financials, but we are holding that as a committed item. So what does that all mean? We've mentioned a few times kind of the planning and the thoughts of the staff as we go forward here. And so looking at last year's budget, our surplus operating funds were largely due to expenditure savings. And so that wasn't like we had a windfall of revenues. We just didn't spend the funds that we currently had allocated. So the surplus funds there that you can see in the reserves are largely due to expenditure savings. We've kind of been talking about generally what our capital improvement program, our CIP, what we really want to maintain the focus there on long-term infrastructure repairs and making sure that we're keeping track with our deferred maintenance. And so it does contain funding. Our CIP does contain funding for routine maintenance around our facilities here, but it does not contain funding for large-scale investments in any facility. So it's kind of keeping the lights on, fixing the leaks, regular maintenance, but it's not any kind of major improvement or investments here in any district facilities. I would note that the district has 2 large facilities that provide workspace for the staff and for the public. That is here where we're now in the administration building and across the street in the courtyard. Those buildings were both originally built in the 60s. They in total, they amass about 60,000 square feet. We also use those for public meeting spaces. Both buildings, if you've ever been here, and we all have, but if the public has ever been here, are in need of significant improvements. And so we've known that for the last couple of years. We're looking into what our options might be there. But in general, we know we're going to have to do some work on that in the coming years. And so staff is proposing a facility reserve fund to help us begin to build towards that. The proposed language that we have in the packet here is that we would accumulate operating fund savings, so not touching the capital fund. So operating fund savings due to vacancies during the surplus years. So we're not counting on this in terms of a budget perspective. We're not trying to take away from what would normally go to capital in terms of our actual water distribution infrastructure. But when we do have savings due to vacancies, we would like and we have a surplus year, we're proposing to be able to accumulate those funds for the purpose of either a purchase, construction, or a major improvement of a work site facility. And then in terms of assigning a balance to those, we want to tie those to the personnel services budget just as a way of kind of maintaining pace with inflation and maintaining pace with the size of our staff. So the minimum balance that we have kind of ascribed to this policy would be 3% of our personnel services budget, which currently is about $2 million, with the target balance of about 20% of the personnel services budget. Over the long term, that'd be about 12.5 million. So we won't be anywhere near that target initially. Last year we had about a $2.5 million salary savings. So that's kind of the general size we're thinking of for the first deposit towards this reserve. But we do want to make sure that the board and the public are clear on what this reserve is for. And I'm happy to take any comments on what the purpose there or any questions you have about the facility reserve.
Great. Thank you. Any comments, Director Mayer?
No, I don't think so. That seems like a wise idea, certainly.
Great, thanks. Yeah, appreciate the update on the reserves, and I'm super glad that we've been able to do that, and it sets us up for a healthy, strong, stable future. When do you think we'll have a more detailed view of what some of these facility updates might look like and some of the options for us to consider?
Engineering, Alex is kicking off a pretty detailed assessment of this facility that we expect by mid to late spring we would bring to the board. That would include, we're targeting a pretty detailed cost estimate of this and the courtyard, and in parallel, Sean and his folks, we have a project looking at Sky Oaks and watershed facilities. So I think this spring, summer, we'll really be able to get our arms around the opportunities and needs for our work site facilities and come up with a strategy to address them.
Okay, great. Yeah, all three have big needs. Are you looking at potentially other options for this building, or just more upgrades? Or
Yeah,
you're already in that thought
we
process?
had gone through a process of looking at other options, and sort of where we've landed is we'll talk to the board about generally is being co-located with the courtyard is of such high value, really trying to understand what it would take to invest in these facilities, because we'll never get that co-location back. And it really is just maintains a connectedness that's very, very difficult to replace.
Yeah.
So we are looking at currently upgrading.
Upgrading this, great. It'd be great to have, I don't know if we get final approval, but good, strong directional approval on where these facility projects are going to go next year, right? I don't know if we do it by summer, but let's
Yeah,
do it.
it's a
Let's add
good
that to our
point.
to-do
I
list.
think my plan at this point would be to develop a strategy and move into kind of full design
Yeah.
by the summer.
Great,
Not that we'd have it done, but a board direction to staff to proceed.
fantastic. That maybe that'll be one thing that we call out in the board meeting as an update for this from this committee meeting would be that's our intention. Okay, great. Any public comment on this item?
There's none.
Terrific. Thank you for your update. Upcoming meetings, we have a Finance Administration Committee meeting on November 20th at 9:30 a.m. And with that, we are adjourned. 26 minutes.